Well, I'm glad to be here, folks. As Bruce was saying, many of the ideas I'm going to present today I got out of a book by T. Harv Eker entitled Secrets of the Millionaire Mind. In the book, Mr. Eker talks about money in particular, but I'm going to refer to any kind of wealth you want: friendship, happiness, peace, joy, whatever it is you want. And the subtitle I've given my speech is, As Above, So Below. Those of you who've studied the works of Judge Thomas Troward will know exactly what that means. And once you get exposure to Judge Troward, you never forget him. Life. Many things in life are filled with opposites. There's an old saying, every coin has two sides. In the real world, we have hot and cold, left and right, correct and wrong, rich and poor, winner or loser. There's a famous scene in the original Wall Street movie with Michael Douglas, where they're sitting in Michael Douglas's limousine, and he says to the young guy next to him, "What makes you different from that man right there?" as he points to a homeless man walking down the street. And one of the things that I found very interesting about Mr. Eker presented, I never thought of before, is different people think differently. I don't want to draw a class thing to it, or a religious thing, but I just don't know how else to say it. He makes the case that there are three ways of thinking. You have the poor man's way of thinking, the middle class man's way of thinking, and the rich man's way of thinking. And at the end, I'm going to go over a whole bunch of examples that he gave. The roots of our thinking is what creates the outer world that we see, the outer effects. Now you're going to get to see my artistic skills. So nobody laugh. Because I promise you, I was never accepted at art school. The roots of our thinking are pretty much in three different phases. We have our mental world, our emotional world. I think Reverend Nancy's done a good job teaching us all the power of emotions. Then we have our spiritual world. And all three of these combine to create our outer world. How we think, the emotional power we put behind it, and what are our spiritual core beliefs that we were taught as little tiny youngins. And one of the things, if you look up Mr. Eker, is, I'm going to try to draw it as good as he draws it. You have the ground, you have the tree, you have the roots, and then you have all the little apples, oranges, lemons, and the fruits on the tree. One of the things that made a lot of sense to me that he presented was, if you don't like the fruits you're getting, there ain't nothing wrong with the tree. You got a problem at the roots. And his analogy is, if you don't like the outer world that we're seeing in our life, our challenge is not in the outer world. You can't change the outer world. But if you change the roots, you fertilize the roots, you give it more soil, you give it more water, that will change the fruits. If you change the root cause of the challenges in your life, which I'll go over a dozen of the most common, then that will change by default the fruit you're getting. I'll let you all enjoy my artwork. And one of the things Judge Troward said was we all live in a thought world. I believe Elaine at one time gave a course several years ago where the premise of the author was everything we see in our life is not real. Everything is all an illusion. But how do we create that illusion? And as Napoleon Hill said, there is no such thing as failure until you decide it's failure. Our visible outward challenges are caused by something that's missing or something that's in our thought process. In this book, he says, a lack of money is never a problem. A dirty car is never a problem. Rotten teeth are never a problem. But rather, that's a symptom of a deeper issue. I'm not going to get into what causes individual problems now, but rather causes and the root causes. Many of us were taught in school, college in particular, that our thoughts lead to our feelings, and our feelings lead to our actions, which in turn create the results we see. Mr. Ecker adds one thing to the beginning of that. Your past programming. What were you taught as a little itty-bitty tiny child from the time you were born to about 6 years of age? That past programming, in turn, leads to what we think. That past programming creates those memory files in our mind, which leads to our feelings and our actions and our results. So the root here is our past programming. What did mommy and daddy, grandma and grandpa, auntie and uncle teach us when we were 2 years old, 3 years old? What did we hear them say? What did we see them do when particular incidents happened or occurred? How did we watch? This is how daddy handled it. This is how grandpa handled it. So a little boy says to himself, well, that must be the way all men handle that particular problem. And I would assume the same thing would handle for little girls. This is what mommy and grandma and auntie did in the kitchen, so this must be the right way to do it. So it gets locked into your memory file, not that this is the right way to do it, but this is the only way to do it. Because after all, mom and dad can't be wrong. We worship them as idols when we're that tiny and don't know any better. There's an old saying, which I heard, which was attributed allegedly to the Jesuits. How true that is, I do not know. But it goes like this. Give me a child from birth to 6 years old. The church now has him for a lifetime. Children are like sponges. They hear and see everything we do. And of course, I'm sure we were told as kids, do as I say, not as I do. And what do we remember when we're 30 years older? We don't remember what mom or dad said we should do. We remember what they did. We all have both good and bad memory files. Our families meant well. At least that's what I'll say for the sake of argument. There are many things they did that were right, And there are many things they could have done a little different. One of the things he says early in this book is, money is a result, wealth is a result, health is a result, illness is a result, your weight is a result. We live in a world of cause and effect. Which to me, just when I heard that at the seminar he gave, which is free, I said, this sounds so science of mind. We live in a world of cause and effect. I don't know about you, but I was raised traditional Christian. Well, if God liked you today, you had good things happen. If God was pissed off at you, then you did something wrong, and that's why you had bad things happen. I prefer to believe this version, cause and effect. If I can figure out what I did wrong, I can change it. As Reverend Nancy says, the first step to change is awareness. When we need to focus on what we do want, not what we don't want. Mr. Eckhart goes on to say, when the subconscious mind must choose between deeply rooted emotional responses, but which what when we're this big, and logic in a stressful situation, which do you think is going to win out? You're going to grab that memory file from when you were 3 years old, and you're going to run with it. You're not going to sit there and say, well, what's the logical thing to do? Let me analyze the situation, the pros and cons. No, you're just going to act from instinct, or rather, past programming. And he goes on to say, as I said before, there are three general ways of thinking. I just don't know a nicer way to phrase it than poor, middle class, and rich. Some of the main differences, he says, was poor people have their defined set of beliefs. Rich people have their very defined. And he said the middle class hover between the two. On some issues, they go this way, and other issues, they go that way. And to me, the first one was another very science of mind way of thinking. He says, rich people believe I create my life. And the poor person version is, life just happens to me. I have no control over anything. And one of the ones that really hit me like a brick wall was his second one. Rich people play whatever game they're playing, put life into the version of a giant game, but rich people play that game to win. Poor people play the game not to lose. And they look at everything and say, what is the worst of this? What's the worst of that? Whereas a rich person says, that's the worst case I can handle, I'm going to go for winning. Rich people are committed to getting whatever it is they want. Friends, relationships, vacations. Whereas a poor person says, I'll take it if the stork brings it to me, but I'm really not going to go out and work for it. I'd rather watch soccer and football and reruns of Golden Girls. Rich people think big. Poor people say, well, $100 is enough. Or 2 friends are enough, whereas a rich person says, I want the whole room to like me. And if you don't like me, well, then that's your problem. Rich people focus on opportunities, whereas poor people focus on obstacles. Rich people admire other rich and successful people. Again, it depends on how you define rich and successful. It doesn't have to always be cash, money. It could be friends. having a busy social calendar, whatever it is that you're interested in. Whereas poor people, they're just resentful. They're jealous. They make up excuses why they shouldn't be with you. And this was another one that stood out to me. Rich people associate with other positive and successful people, whereas poor people like to mill around and complain and hold gripe sessions and pity parties. Reverend Nancy told me years ago when I first joined, she said, "Okay, Ed, I'll listen to your story. We'll have a pity party for exactly 5 minutes." She looked at her watch. The 5 minutes went, "Okay, time's up. I heard enough of your story. What are you going to do to change the situation?" And that's what, and she literally waited for me to come up with an idea. I said, "Go ahead, try it. The worst could happen is it doesn't work. But if you think about it and you do your analysis, you're not a dumb man. It will probably work." And lo and behold, it worked. My solution worked. So I said to that problem, "Bye, don't come back." And he says, rich people are bigger than their problems, whereas poor people like to dwell on them. They're smaller than their problems. And this is another one that stood out to me from the Bible, attributed to Jesus himself. He says, rich people are excellent givers and receivers, whereas poor people are just excellent receivers. He points out, look in the Bible, what does it say? It says give and receive. It does not say receive and then give. It does not say only receive. The left hand has to wash the right hand. If one of the hands is missing, neither hand gets washed. He says rich people think you can have both wealth, again, however you define it, and happiness. Whereas poor people think, well, I can have one or the other. And he points out, the Bible doesn't say money is the root of all evil. The complete line is the love of money is the root of all evil. When you put money above everything else in your life, that's when you have problems. And another one that stood out to me was, rich people act in spite of fear. They take educated, calculated risks. And he says, that's what doctors do every time we go to them. They do their exam, they look at you. I think you have an infection. Unless that man runs a laboratory test, sends it off to the lab, and 3 days later says, you got an infection. He's taking an educated guess. And that's what he says rich people do, whereas poor people allow fear to just stop them in their tracks. Oh, I can't do that. Something bad could happen. And when you go to his seminar, he says, how many of you were born knowing how to drive your car? How many of you drove to get here this morning? You could have been killed on the way in, but you learned how to do it. And when the first time you drove with your mom or dad or whoever was teaching you, did you pull out of the parking lot and get right onto the freeway and do 80 miles an hour? You're lucky you went around the building in the parking lot. And if you went over 10 miles an hour, you were going fast compared to what I had to do. The first time I remember that was driving around the building, and the instructor said, don't put your foot on the gas. Keep your foot on the brake. We'll coast around the building at about 8 to 10 miles an hour. That's all we're going to do today. But I want you to have the steering wheel. And the last thing he said was, rich people freely admit they do not have all the answers. How many of us have relatives, no matter what the problem is, they know you handled it wrong. They don't know what the right answer is, but they just know you did it wrong. And he did give out 2 pages of affirmations, which I was surprised. He said, folks, you have to get these things into your subconscious. If you're 25 years old, you have probably 24 years worth of programming in you. The fact you're here tells me there's some good stuff in your programming. We just want to increase the good and chew away the not so good. And he said the same thing Reverend Nancy says. He said, our families and our parents did the best they knew how to do at the time they did it. He said, all of us in this room virtually are old enough to have children of our own. Is there something you would have done when they were 4 years old differently now that they're 10 and you have 6 more years of real world experience? And we all sat there going, well, there's probably at least one. So, as I was saying, our thoughts lead to our visible world. And that's how I got so above, so below.